Probation is an important part of the U.S. criminal justice system and provides convicted offenders with a chance to avoid prison and go back to work. Every year, millions of offenders are sent home on the condition that they obey certain technical rules. These can include regular meetings with a probation officer, avoiding alcohol and drugs, and making timely payments of court fees and fines. Breaking these rules results in a technical violation and can lead to incarceration. In fact, in many states, these violations account for more than 30% of all prison spells. These policies are generally motivated by public safety concerns. To the extent that violations are correlated with future criminal behavior, they allow courts to identify and imprison those probationers who are most likely to reoffend. But technical incarcerations are also expensive. Supervising a probationer at home costs just 5% as much as housing them in prison. Violations are also significantly more common among Black men and are a key driver of racial disparities in prison exposure. This paper evaluates the probation system on 2 dimensions. First, how effective is it to imprison technical rule breakers? Does this policy actually target those who would otherwise engage in criminal behavior or deter reoffending? And second, what are the equity implications? To what extent are there racial differences in targeting and deterrence? To answer these questions, the author studies the impact of a 2011 reform in North Carolina that restricted the scenarios in which a probationer could be incarcerated. While judges could previously revoke probation for any technical violation, post-reform they could only do so for a subset. As a result, many probationers who would previously have been imprisoned for breaking a rule were now permitted to remain free. This figure shows the effect of the reform. Each line corresponds to the group of individuals who started probation during a given 3-month period, and shows the share of that group that was incarcerated for breaking a technical rule over the next 365 days. Prior to the reform, the rate of technical incarcerations is around 15% and is fairly similar across different cohorts. This begins to decline, however, for cohorts whose 1-year probation spell overlaps with the 2011 reform. Incarceration rates fall by steeper amounts for those who are more exposed to the reform, and ultimately, those who are fully exposed have rates of around 9%, a 33% drop relative to the pre-reform mean. What impact did this have on crime rates? If technical incarcerations effectively target and imprison high-risk probationers, then restricting them and allowing more of these individuals to remain in their communities should lead to increased crime and higher arrest rates. To investigate this, the author compares the pre- and post-reform trajectories of supervised probationers, that is, those who are assigned to a probation officer who is responsible for monitoring them, and those who are convicted of similar offenses but who are placed on unsupervised probation. While this second group is subject to the same rules, technical violations are rarely enforced for them due to the lack of monitoring. Thus, they were largely unaffected by the 2011 reform and can serve as a control group. This figure plots the estimated difference in outcomes between these groups. The solid red line marks the first cohort whose 1-year probation spell overlapped with the new reform, while the dotted line marks the first whose spell was entirely in the post-reform period. Technical incarcerations declined by 5.5 percentage points as a result of the reform, and there was a corresponding uptick in arrests of 2 percentage points. In other words, 37% of probationers who were spared technical incarceration went on to commit a crime and were rearrested over their first year of probation. This suggests that technical incarcerations do succeed in removing some fraction of high-risk probationers from the community. At the same time, the rate of both false negatives and false positives appears to be high. The author estimates that only 6.5% of potential reoffenders were caught by the technical rules affected by the reform. Moreover, 5.8% of non-reoffenders break the same rules. In other words, these technical violations are almost as likely to target low-risk probationers as they are to target high-risk ones. There is also no evidence of significant deterrence effects. In addition, looking separately at Black and white probationers reveals a troubling pattern. While the reform nearly eliminated the Black-white gap in technical incarcerations, there was essentially no change in the Black-white gap in arrests. This indicates that the rule violations affected by the reform disproportionately tagged and incarcerated low-risk Black probationers. While 50% of white probationers who were spared incarceration went on to be rearrested during their first year, the analogous figure for Black probationers was only 30%. Among the different types of rule violations, those related to non-payment of fines and fees perform especially poorly on both effectiveness and equity. They are poor predictors of future crime and drive racial disparities. Overall, these results indicate that while rule violations are correlated with criminality, they are significantly less predictive of future offending among Black probationers. Notably, this does not appear to be driven by discrimination. Black and white probationers are punished equivalently, conditional on breaking the same rule, and racial gaps exist even for violations with little room for discretionary enforcement. Rather, the author argues this is an example of how ostensibly race-neutral policies can still have disparate impacts. This suggests that in order to address racial disparities in the criminal justice system, it is necessary to look at how the rules are designed and not just how they are enforced. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. These include other papers studying racial disparities in the criminal justice system, many of which focus on the role of discrimination, and a broader body of research on criminal justice and economic outcomes.